The main purpose of my presentation today is to give an overview of the ramifications from a UAE legal perspective of the Abraham Accords, together with the business opportunities which will necessarily arise from the Accords. But first, let me start with some of the basics. So the normalization of ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, followed by Bahrain, and also a few short weeks ago, Sudan, is obviously a major diplomatic breakthrough. It marks, as Jonathan noted, the commencement of a fundamental shift in the regional geopolitical landscape in the Middle East with potential effects beyond. To put things in perspective, the Abraham Accords are the first peace agreement signed between Israel and its Arab neighbors in more than 25 years. The UAE, along with Bahrain, shortly thereafter, and Sudan, a couple of weeks ago, are only 5 out of the 22 members of the Arab League to have normalized relationships with Israel. The peace agreements, which Daniel knows very well, previously signed with Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994, were mostly focused on security concerns and land-related issues in a vastly different context. While national security, whether it is common regional security interests and concerns for both countries, food and water security, are at the heart of the Abraham Accords, they also set the stage for increased cooperation between Israel and its Arab counterparts at all levels: cultural, political, religious, diplomatic, and trade and commerce. In particular, the UAE-Israel-Abraham Accords highlight the number of areas where the parties have agreed to cooperate. It is finance and investment, civil aviation, visas and consular services, innovation, trade and economic relations, healthcare, water security, legal cooperation, energy, protection of the environment, tourism, sport, and culture. The UAE-Israel-Abraham Accords also contemplate that the two countries intend to enter into additional agreements or treaties to further strengthen their cooperation in those spheres, some of which have already started to be entered into, which I will discuss later. In addition to being a diplomatic breakthrough of historic significance, the Accords present exciting opportunities for trade and commerce between the concerned countries, which is the main focus of my presentation today. From a trade and commerce perspective, both Israel and other signatories of the Abraham Accords could greatly benefit from increased cooperation. Early estimates indicate that the normalization of ties could soon see bilateral trade in excess of $6 billion. This is particularly true for the UAE, which is a trade and commerce hub with very significant capital pools, such as sovereign wealth funds, which could be potentially tapped by Israeli companies seeking to raise capital. With its business-friendly environment, the UAE is a favored hub for multinationals doing business in the GCC region, the wider Middle East, and in Africa. Likewise, the UAE could greatly benefit from increased cooperation with Israeli leading innovators, especially in tech, finance, and pharma, and agri-tech. The opportunity for both countries to benefit from cross-border investment flows and broader technological cooperation are enormous. Based on reactions from the business community in the UAE and some of our clients, the Abraham Accords and the opportunities that come with them were very well received. Now, let me say a few words about the implementation of the Abraham Accords from a legal perspective in the UAE legal system. Prior to the Abraham Accords, there was a strict restriction in the UAE about any individuals, companies doing any type of business with Israel or Israeli companies or individuals. The restriction extended to shipping or doing any type of trade or commerce with Israeli goods. one of the first steps that was taken by the UAE government as a direct implementation of the Abraham Accords was to repeal the previously enacted boycott statute that was in place in the UAE. The direct implication of that is that it will now be possible for entities, people, residents, citizens in the UAE to do direct trade and business with Israel without necessarily the need to use, which was the case in the past, nominee jurisdiction in order to do business in the UAE. Accordingly, the repeal of the boycott statute represent a very significant opportunity for both Israeli businesses willing to do business in the UAE, but the broader GCC region, but also for the UAE businesses willing to do trade and commerce with Israeli businesses and invest in Israel. Now, let me talk about a few of the practical impacts that have taken place since the Abraham Accords have been signed. Immediately after the Abraham Accords were announced, the phone lines, which were previously restricted and did not allow to place phone calls to the 972 country code, where restriction was lifted. So it's now possible to place calls directly without using a VPN from the UAE to Israel. It's also possible now, which was not possible before, to access Israeli website, including news website, without using, again, a VPN. So this restriction was lifted. Another significant change which has taken place is the possibility to travel directly to Israel. And a number of airline operators are now running direct flights to and from both Abu Dhabi and Dubai to Tel Aviv. So Etihad Airways, which is the national UAE airline based in Abu Dhabi, is having regular flights to Tel Aviv. Likewise, Emirates, which is the airline based in Dubai, has regular flight service to Tel Aviv, and El Al as well as regular service to Israel. The other developments which have taken place and are very positive, Bank Leumi, I don't know if I pronounced the name correctly, but Bank Leumi signed a memorandum of understanding recently with Emirates NBD, which is one of the largest bank in the Emirates, in order to foster cooperation and strengthen their relationship, allowing them to trade together and potentially service clients on both sides. Another very interesting development has been the setup on a tripartite basis of a development fund by the UAE, Israel, and the US, which aims to raise $3 billion of funds in order to promote some of the investments in the region towards infrastructure, energy security, and reliable access to electricity and clean water in the region. The other key development is that, obviously a very significant breakthrough, is the fact that the UAE has now officially requested to open an embassy in Tel Aviv. This has not happened yet, but this is in process. Another key element was that Israel and the UAE have signed a visa exemption program, which is the very first of its kind, and I don't think that Israel has any of those with any of its any other country in the region, allowing citizens on both sides to travel without the need to request a visa, which obviously will greatly facilitate travel between the two countries. And some other anecdotal developments which are quite significant on a day-to-day basis, and will have an impact on the reception of people of those changes. A few shops, a few businesses have started to open businesses in the UAE, and it's already happening. And kosher food is also being served in hotels in both Abu Dhabi and some of the hotels in Dubai. So obviously this is very significant. Now, if we look at the sectors which are likely to benefit from this cooperation. The first one that comes to mind is tech and innovation. I mean, obviously, Israel is very well known as a technological hub, which has a large number of its technology companies listed on NASDAQ, which obviously presents a very strong interest for the UAE. I mean, the UAE is seeking on a constant basis for an outlet for investments that will bring value to its nation. And there's a strong incentive in the UAE to deploy funds in technology and companies that could potentially bring the technology to the UAE. And for example, very recently, the DIFC, which is a financial free zone, set up a $100 million fund dedicated to investment in technology, which has expressed an interest in potentially making investment in Israel. The other sector which is likely to benefit from the normalization of ties is oil and oil security. I mean, Israel obviously has access to some oil resources through the Leviathan and Tamar oil fields, but with new ties with the UAE, it will also have another supplier of very precious oil coming from the UAE. The other sector which might benefit from the normalization of ties is tourism and travel. I mean, with the flights, the regular flights that have started, in spite of the COVID crisis, a number of tourists have started coming to the UAE, and more we hear people, delegations of people and tourists coming to the UAE, which is obviously a very positive development. The other sector, very significant sector where there will be cooperation is health and pharma. And as a matter of fact, the UAE and Israel already cooperated prior to the Abraham Accords on the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. And we will only see increased cooperation. And there are already talks about potential joint ventures between leading pharma companies in the UAE and Israeli companies. So these are just a few illustrations of the sectors that are likely to benefit from this. There probably will be many more, which obviously, is being welcomed by the business community here. I'm just mindful of the time because I've already spoken a lot. Just one more point I would want to make is we started receiving inquiries from Israeli businesses looking to potentially set up a presence here. I mean, traditionally, Israeli businesses would do business in the region, but it was done in a discreet manner through the use of nominee companies set up in Cyprus or other jurisdiction, not necessarily to disclose the Israeli ownership. Now, this restriction doesn't need, or this type of structuring is not required. And we've received a number of inquiries from Israeli companies looking to, set up joint ventures or otherwise establish a permanent presence in the UAE, which obviously makes sense. And the UAE is seen very often as a hub to set up a business presence in the region to, potentially have access to the greater GCC and the Middle East. And the last thing in that respect I wanted to say is that from a tax perspective, this will be an efficient setup with discussions underway to establish a double tax treaty between the UAE and Israel. So all of this to say that, this is a very positive environment for the development of business between the two countries and the greater region. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Rodolphe. Daniel, straight over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, Rodolfo and Jonathan and Caroline for setting this up. And it's a great pleasure speaking on a UK LFI event. With your permission, I'd like to divide my time between two aspects of the issue. I will start with because of my background in peace negotiations, I will say a few words about the geopolitical consequences, and then I will try to mirror Rodolfo's explanation of the more commercial aspects in a few words about the Israeli perspective. First of all, Rodolphe is absolutely right. This is the first peace agreement we've had in the region for 26 years. I was very fortunate to be the lawyer for the Israeli negotiating team on the Israeli-Jordanian Treaty of Peace many years ago, and it's been a long time coming, and this was a wonderful occurrence. However, this is not similar to either the Jordanian or Egyptian treaties in two important things. First of all, this treaty is actually bottom-up because trade relations and friendship between Israelis and the UAE have existed now for around 15 years. So the fact is that the leaders just caught up, but we were already on friendly relations for years, and including I have many clients in the Gulf for years now whom I've been representing in Israel on their business activity, and vice versa. And the second difference is that this is the first treaty where both sides actually mean it. So in that respect, and for those people asking questions about will this treaty follow in the footsteps of the previous treaties, I don't think so. I think this is a totally new animal we will have to learn from scratch. I do want to say a few words about what brought this around. Now, everyone says, well, it's a unique combination of elements, but I don't actually think that's true. I don't think it was a unique combination of elements which brought about this treaty. I think the timing was a result of certain alignment of stars, but the components were all there, and there were two very important components. The first is there's a saying in the Middle East. Now, I made it up a few years ago, but I am in the Middle East, so it's a saying in the Middle East. So the saying in the Middle East is that in the Middle East, your enemy's enemy is your enemy's enemy. It doesn't necessarily become your friend, but to be an enemy's enemy is an extraordinarily powerful relationship in the Middle East. And we in the UAE and most of the Gulf countries have a shared enemy, which is the state of Iran. And in that respect, this has been a magnet pushing us ever closer over the last decade. And the second thing is that both countries and both regions understand that there's incredible potential synergy between us. It's economic, it's defense, it's cultural, it's in so many different areas that the pressure has been building for a long time. And the fact that certain stars relating to Trump and Netanyahu and other components just happened to be in the right place was a triggering event for something which was on the books for a long time. So that's for the geopolitical aspect. And then I'd like to say a few words about the legal aspect. First of all, interestingly enough, this is not a mirror image of the Rodolphe story about the UAE. Let's start by saying that Israel never responded to the Arab boycott with an Israeli boycott. So trade with the Arab countries, with the sole exception of Iran, which is not an Arab country, but Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, is totally allowed from the Israeli side. And as a result of that, there was no boycott law to terminate or cancel or repeal in Israel. And in fact, we didn't need to change any laws because it was already totally allowed to do business from day one. And as I said, trade has existed now for, I think, over 10 years. Most of it, but this is the important thing, the way we used to do trade with the UAE is we'll always have to do it through third-party entities in Europe. So we would set up a company in Europe, which would be a go-between, and that company would be the reseller. But you do need to understand that everyone knew who everyone was. In fact, they were coming shopping for Israeli goods, and we were selling to them, but we had to go through this circuitous route. And the only issues we had were with banks who kept asking us, are you sure this is okay? And we said, oh, everyone's happy with this. And the bank said, well, in that case, we'll be happy to assist. I even share with you, I had a really weird situation once when I was representing a group of companies doing a deal with the Gulf. And under that law that Rodolphe was talking about, the boycott law, all government entities in the Gulf were required to inject a clause into all of their contracts, making sure that none of the goods were of Israeli origin. Now, the Israeli companies had no problem signing this with everyone fully understanding that we were lying. But the American companies couldn't sign it because in the US, to sign such a clause is a federal offense. So we couldn't use any American subsidiaries because the Israelis were signing saying, no, we're not Israeli, we're fine. But the Americans couldn't join the deal. We had to come up with different companies to fix it. So I give this as an anecdote to show you how everyone was trying to bypass it while at the same time maintaining the facade of formal enmity. So what's going on now? First of all, there's incredible interest. We're getting, I think, an average of 2 or 3 meetings a day from interested parties, either from Israel or from the UAE side, all wanting to make contact and identify opportunities. I want to follow on what Rodolphe said. What are the relative areas of interest for each side? So as we see it from the UAE looking towards Israel, I think the primary areas of interest are, first of all everything high-tech, because Israel is a high-tech hub. Secondly, anything R&D related, because Israel is a global R&D center for all of the major companies, etc. And we have an advantage that we have a rather significant pool of very young and very talented engineers, scientists, etc., which many companies would like to draw upon. Also, we are starting to see that there may be some interest, surprisingly enough, in real estate. Apparently, owning property in the Holy Land is sexy in this context, if we look at the Arab part of the world. And we starting to understand that there will be parts of Israel which will be drawing significant interest in this area. If we look at the Israeli side, looking toward the UAE, well, the UAE is first and foremost a significant market in and of itself, especially for high-end goods, or I won't go into any more details, obviously the defense market. But in addition to that, the UAE looks like a very promising potential location for regional hubs for larger Israeli companies, because through the UAE, and especially if you adopt an onshore approach and you take a made in the UAE approach, you can actually market to most of Asia, Africa, etc., extraordinarily effectively. So many Israeli companies already recognize that it could be quite useful to set up shop somewhere in the UAE, be it Abu Dhabi or Dubai. That's a complicated discussion in and of itself, and everyone is offering enticing benefits to come in and set up shop. And obviously the UAE has this thing where they have no tax. And from a country like Israel, where both our corporate tax and our income tax are relatively high, that is quite an enticing carrot for Israeli entities. Having said that, I want to finish on a slightly more realistic note, and that is that there are still some obstacles before we can actually have totally free and effective trade. First and foremost, the Abraham Accords were only a framework for numerous agreements, implementing agreements, which need to follow. And Israeli press has just has published that I think 18 new agreements have been ratified in Israel between them. We have not been able to identify 18 such agreements. And I'm actually in the middle of discussions with my government colleagues who haven't found 18 either. But the reality is the press has said 18, so someone gave them that number. But people are negotiating new agreements on a daily basis. And those are implementing agreements, so double taxation and a few other issues which would make commercial life easier. And for example, the banking agreement which has been signed theoretically allows transfer of SWIFT transfers from the UAE to Israel. But here are a few hiccups. First of all, Israel is a bureaucratic country. So it's not as speedy as the UAE in government response to new opportunities. It takes time for government officials to come up with the new guidelines and procedures to facilitate. Secondly, Israeli licensing rules have no exceptions for friendly countries. So in cases where you want to sell or something to a foreigner, you may need a license and an approval for that. And Israel has never faced the challenge of what companies will we allow to be sold to friendly Arab nations before. We've had that challenge with the Chinese and the Russians, but now we're talking about a different type of neighbor, and that neighbor we've never faced before. And I can share with you that I'm already in the middle of quite serious discussions with the government, which doesn't know what to do yet, but they'll figure it out. Another challenge is, for some reason, the United Arab Emirates appears on the FATF task force list of high-risk money laundering locations, which isn't good news, because the moment you're on that high list, then all of the banking industry is subject to a guidance saying you have to exercise higher levels of caution for all money transfers between Israel and the UAE. And actually a recent guidance from the Bank of Israel to all Israeli banks said exactly that, and designated specific safe harbor type arrangements, but saying everything else needs to go under heightened scrutiny. So it's not going to be as simple as saying, I want to transfer $10 million from my account in UAE to Israel. You will have to go through quite a complicated KYC and due diligence process before you'll be able to convince any bank to touch your money. So that's a challenge we'll have to work through. And I think the final challenge is, we're talking about two peoples who don't know one another. We've read about one another, we've heard of one another, we've done some small deals with one another, but as a people, the people of the UAE and the people of Israel have not really met in person. And as a result, one of the biggest obstacles to trade is we don't know one another. And you need to know the right people in order to get good access, in order to identify the right opportunities. And this is part of the learning process that we are now starting. So I am optimistic that this is going to hold. This is different from anything we've done before. It's being built from the bottom up. There's incredible energy in this process, but there's still a lot of work to be done before we can streamline it and make it highly effective and efficient. But because of the high motivation levels, I'm very optimistic that we're going to get there sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. Very interesting and perfectly paves the way for now further questions from the audience. I mentioned at the outset that we've had a few in advance. The first one I think you've already touched on. Will this be another cold peace, or is the UAE population as such, so not talking about government level, but the population as such in support? Rodolphe, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, I mean, the one comment I can make on this is, from the business community perspective, and some of our clients, this has been well received. As far as the general population in the UAE, one thing I can say is that probably their level of political engagement is not very high. So as far as we can tell, there's not been any specific reaction to the Abraham Accords.
Thank you. A second question received in advance is whether we can expect, firstly, the new US administration to further develop the momentum for more peace deals with Gulf Arab states without waiting for implied consent from the Palestinians. And there was a second limb, and that other countries like the UK, Australia, and others, I would like you to include, please, EU in that category of others. So UK, Australia, let's say, and EU will support the idea of peace in the Middle East without Palestinian blessing. Daniel, perhaps you could start with that.
That's an incredibly complicated and sensitive question, and I assume we have 2 hours to discuss it, Jonathan. But assuming you want me to give you a soundbite response, I'll do my best. Let's be fair. I mean, I spent 20 years of my life negotiating peace with the Palestinians, and I'm one of the people who failed, okay? And I'm not going to assign blame now if it's us, if it's them, if it's a planet, if it's the God, whatever. It didn't work. Now, that led to two groups of thought. Option one saying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is at the core of all the problems in the Middle East, and unless that is resolved, everything else cannot be resolved. And the second saying, well, okay, we can't resolve the tough cookie, so let's try and resolve all the rest of them and leave that for last, and then maybe that will create a positive atmosphere where we'll get all the support we need to finally resolve that issue. Now, obviously, there were a million variations on that theme in between, including people who didn't intend to do anything on the Israeli-Palestinian track and then just move to other tracks. But the reality is that during the last 3 or 4 years, the second idea took forth. And at the end of the day, if you look at what happened was that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has declined in global interest from a top 10 list. It's probably not the top 100 list anywhere. Because there are so many other events globally, be it Syria, be it Russia and the Ukraine or Crimea, be it China, be it China-US war, trade war. I mean, I can give you a long list of things which are way more interesting to everyone than us and our Palestinian neighbors. And that decline in global interest, and it's been obvious because if you look at newspapers globally, you can see in the past, every day you'd have something, and now you'd be hard-pressed to find one thing a month. That indicated the fact that the world has more or less moved on from our conflict. And I think that cleared the path in some respects of the fact that everyone is now accepting the idea that peace between Israel and its other neighbors does not necessarily mean that we've put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to bed, because we have not, but it's not a bad idea to have more peace agreements on the ground with other countries as creating an atmosphere. And I think once we've started that domino effect, I think it may continue irrespective of who is a US president or an Israeli prime minister, but it could be derailed by other events, regional events, other regional players, etc. So, you know, I think we're on a new track here for more regional cooperation and or agreement, but it could be derailed by other events. But I don't think that the change in the US administration means stop all peace talks with the Middle East, only go back to the Palestinian-Israeli track. I don't think the Americans are going there either.
Okay, and Daniel, before I hand over to Rodolphe, any brief comment on whether and to what extent this will influence the UK, EU in terms of their behavior?
The truth is that the EU, which used to include the UK last time, we discussed
but
this.
But doesn't currently.
I agree. Took a position along the line of the first track I discussed earlier. In other words, resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first. Yeah. But to be fair, that sounds easier from Brussels than it does from the Middle East. So, and it's quite easy to come up with great ideas when you don't actually have to implement them or live them. And having lived through these last, years of conflict and negotiations, etc., all of the ideas which we put forward, and we did invest in them, I mean, lifetimes. And I mean, yesterday, one of my longtime counterparts, Sai Barakat, passed away from coronavirus in an Israeli hospital. Yeah. And while I never agreed with anything Sai said, I viewed him as my friend, and he was invited to my wedding many years ago. So I say that because we and the Palestinians understand each other much better than everyone else does. With all, I beg forgiveness from everyone else listening in. And the fact is that we can't resolve it is something which we should take seriously. And therefore, I think the EU and the UK, will never say that it's a bad idea for Israel to make peace with other Arab countries, because that's not a statement the country can say today without sounding stupid. But secondly, we'll be pushing with the new US administration to a re-energizing of the Israeli-Palestinian track in parallel with this new initiative. And for me, I think that's what we should expect in the next few years. But realistically, with COVID-19, Brexit, and everything else on the table, I don't think this will ever be a serious priority for anyone in the EU or the UK in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Rodolphe?
I don't have anything else to add on that topic.
Okay.
I mean,
No, that's fine. Another question. The decision by Israel to backtrack on annexation could suggest that the West Bank is off limits due to these peace agreements. Will Israel be restricted or bound to not extend or confirm sovereignty under the American plan?
So that's a great question. And the short answer is I don't have a clue. And I don't think anyone has, because unless you were a fly on the wall of the prime minister when he talked to President Trump, we won't know if he did promise and what he promised. I know what he said publicly. And publicly, he said he never promised to put it off the table. I agreed to delay these issues until future time. But the reality is we now have a new US president who will obviously be much less susceptible to supporting a unilateral Israeli annexation of territory. So it may be that in and of itself just put it off the table, irrespective of what was agreed in the context of the Abraham Accords. And we'll all have to wait and see how this develops.
Now, coming to some of the questions on the Q&A base, one of those actually ties in with a report I read in Haaretz just today, saying US approved sale of F-35 jets, advanced defense equipment to UAE, Pompeo says. And the question on the site is the sale of F-35s and its ramifications, or rather, what is the ramifications on Israel's qualitative military edge?
And it depends who you will. I'll start, and this used to be my area of responsibility when I was in the army, Jonathan. I used to be negotiating these agreements with the Americans. Mm-hmm. Israel has always maintained two principles in its relationship with its US ally. We need to be able to protect ourselves by ourselves against any and all combination of threats. In other words, we don't want to be in a situation where we need anyone else to help us. We want to have that capability in-house. And that is one of our basic premises of our national security policy. The second aspect of that, however, is we want to maintain a qualitative edge over all of our potential foes in the region. And that obviously raises the question of what do you do with countries you've just made peace with? So for example, we made peace with Egypt in 1979, but Israel has still been very careful in supporting the buildup of the Egyptian Navy over the years. Now, it's not because we have any anticipation that we will go to war with Egypt, but the realization that the Egyptian regime could be unstable, and as we saw over the last 10 years, they changed regime 3 times quite quickly, shows you the risk of what could happen if that type of weaponry fell into the wrong hand. That is the type of discussion.
Mind you, they're changing regime less frequently than in Israel, but the ramifications of the change in Israel or changes are perhaps not quite so significant.
I accept that criticism, Jonathan, and I have no defense, and I can't defend our politicians any better than Americans can defend theirs. So with that in mind, I think the discussion in Israel is legitimate, given the fact that this is a new peace. So there are different views on the question of what type of weaponry should be given to our newfound friends. Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, like always in the past, some type of compromise solution will be found, which will enable the Emiratis to further strengthen their military capabilities. But the reality is they're so small, and their size in this matter actually has an impact, because the UAE is it's a collection of a few Emirates, but financially they're huge, but militarily they're relatively small. And in that respect, I don't think that is going to be an existential threat to Israel, even in a nightmare scenario, but it doesn't prevent many senior Israelis saying that is a concern. I think it will work its way out. I think we have some time because the F-35 project, I know because I'm involved in it, has a very long lifespan. So this is not something which will jump on the table tomorrow. But my feeling is that some type of new balance will be found, which will maintain the relationship, but will also maintain Israel's qualitative edge.
Thank you. Rodolphe.
Oh, the only comment I could make on this is that there was an important consideration from what we could hear locally in the Emirates. But obviously Daniel more eloquently spoke about this subject than I did. So that's the only comment I have on this.
Rodolphe, I'm going to take a question that I think is likely to be more your beat, or at least as much your beat, and that is the question of sports. I recent mention that the football leagues in Israel and the UAE have signed a working agreement, and perhaps I know football is the #1 watched sport in the world, but perhaps there are also other sports which might flourish between the two. Any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, from what we've heard, I mean, there were a number of sport events that even before the Abraham Accords were organized between the two countries. And this is one area where, as Daniel said, is a great opportunity for, people to know each other. And, football is a sport that is very much followed here. I suspect it's the same in Israel. So, it's a great way to create bridges between, people, to know each other better. So it's obviously a very good development.
Jonathan, I'll just add an anecdote. One of the players from the Israeli national team has now moved to an Emirati team 2 months ago. So he now plays in the Emirates. So we're creating ties as we speak. And I've heard that there's going to be a match between one of the Emirate teams and one of the Israeli teams in Israel soon. So we use it's a new ping pong.
Okay. Now, both of you with your crystal balls, another question: when will the Saudis join the party? That's obviously a big question. And coming back, it sort of shades of your enemy's enemy. It resonates very much, I think, in that context. Rodolphe, starting with you, any inside track on that, or any comments on that?
I unfortunately don't have any inside track, but it's a very complex question. I mean, Saudi is in the process of a transition. Obviously, the younger guard with Mohammed bin Salman is, looking to modernize the kingdom to some extent. The key question is, are the people in Saudi Arabia ready for such a drastic change? And the question is, it's a difficult question to answer. The only thing I would say, which was an encouraging development, was the fact that Bahrain, which is often seen in the region as a proxy for Saudi Arabia, did sign the Abraham Accords. So it might be an indication as to the political will in Saudi Arabia.
Excellent. Good.
On that, Jonathan, may I add, again, no insider information, although I do know a bit more, but my feeling is that the Saudis are watching carefully now to see what will happen as a result of these UAE and Bahrain Israeli agreements. And they will be adopting that watchful position for a while until they see what fallout, if any, exists. If they come to because all of the interests which apply to the UAE apply equally to Saudi. That's not the issue. The issue is that they have additional agendas that they need to address, which are the same in the UAE. And therefore, I think they will play a short waiting game. If they see that there are very few downsides and some upsides of that formal relationship, they will jump for it.
Mhm.
But I think if I were them, I would wait a bit and see to make sure that nothing bad happens as a result of this first.
Thank you. Now, you've talked a little bit about, let's say, the Western world, US, UK, EU. What about another significant world player, China? How is China reacting to this, and how can it be expected to behave?
Shall I start, Rodolfo?
Yes, please go ahead.
I don't think they care. Look, I'll talk about Israel, okay? China-Israel trade is almost entirely one-sided. China is Israel's second largest trading partner. The number one for imports and the number two for exports in Israel. Most people don't know that, and number one is still the United States, and that is in spite of the fact that the United States has forced Israel to limit its exports to China to prevent export of sensitive Israeli technologies for the last several years. So it could have been much bigger. For China, Israel is interesting primarily for three reasons. One, because of our high-tech capability, which is competitive to what you can find in the United States, but closer and doesn't come with so much baggage.
Mm-hmm.
Two, because we have a unique arrangement with the United States for trade, and if they can jump on that and create products in Israel using Chinese technology, they could get them into the US, bypassing a lot of US limitations. And three, because in our region, we are an important player, let's call it that. However, we are very small in the Chinese map. And the fact that we just made peace with an even smaller entity in the Persian Gulf would be of interest to them, but not of dramatic interest. I think the Chinese are above that level in the way they view us. And as long as their long-term plans, you know, the creating the one road, one bridge, one greater China,
Yes.
as long as we don't interfere with that, I don't think you will find them voicing too much opinion on any of this.
Rodolphe, have you?
Yeah, no, I agree with Daniel. I don't think that the Chinese are so concerned about, what is a regional agreement. And, even though they are a significant trade partner to the UAE, mostly, importing goods to the UAE, I agree with Daniel. I don't think that they will necessarily want to interfere in this relationship, and they don't necessarily have a strong opinion about it.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, there are many more questions than time to answer, and I'm told by Caroline that there has to be a hard halt, or whatever it's called, on expiry of the 1 hour in just a few minutes' time. But perhaps time for a quick final question. Do you think there's any chance of Iran making conciliatory gestures to Israel as a way to secure its position? Does it feel threatened by these developments? So the position of Iran vis-a-vis this. Rodolphe, any comment from your side?
I'll leave this one for Daniel.
Okay.
Okay. Let's say, Jonathan, I would be pleasantly surprised. I'm quite confident the Iranians are very uncomfortable with this new rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf. It creates a counter coalition of countries to what they've been trying to develop, which is an axis which goes from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and possibly to Lebanon through Hezbollah. And they're creating what we call the Iranian crescent. And suddenly Israel has just created a counter crescent, which goes through Israel and Jordan and potentially Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt. And suddenly you have these two bigger globes of countries facing off one another. So I think they will be very uncomfortable. Will they make conciliatory measures towards Israel? That's not in their DNA. So I don't think that is to be expected. Will they be more careful now that they understand that the relationships are more formally aligned? I would assume they would be more careful. I think for them, the primary issue now is to figure out what the Biden administration is going to be doing with the Iranian sanctions. And if I were the Iranian leadership, that would be my number one agenda item. And the machinations of Israel and the Emiratis would be a bit lower on my list.
So it needn't affect the script writers for what's now showing on Netflix, Tehran.
There'll probably be a chapter addressing this as well, but no, I don't think it's going to be a direct influence. I think it's part of a longer game.
Right. Well, I would like to give each of you just literally a minute or so to make any closing comment you'd like to, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up. Great shame, because I'm sure we could continue, as you said, for hours. So, Rodolphe, would you like to kick off? Any closing comment?
No, absolutely. Thank you first of all for inviting me on this panel. This was a very interesting discussion. From our perspective, and we are commercial lawyers, corporate lawyers, we see this change as a very positive evolution, which will foster increased activity in the region, which will be good. Prosperity is necessarily a vector of peace, and it will be good for the region as a whole. We do welcome this evolution.
Excellent. Daniel?
Yeah, if you told me 10 years ago that in 10 years' time we'll have a peace treaty with the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, and possibly other countries to follow, I would have laughed and said, I would like to have what you had. Having said that, I'm reminded of something what our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, said. And he said that in the Holy Land, if you do not believe in miracles, you're not a realist. Mm. So I tend to believe, I'm an optimist. And what I'm seeing now gives me cause to smile, that the right people are talking about the right things at the right time. And I am also hopeful that more right people will follow in their footsteps. And I'm mindful of the fact that we have still a lot of issues we need to resolve, putting aside the current global pandemic. But I think these are wonderful steps towards a better future for everyone in the Middle East, and not just Israelis and Emiratis.
Excellent. So I'm afraid that's it time-wise, but I'm sure all of you will want to join with me in thanking our speakers for their insights and for dealing so ably with our numerous questions, which, and unfortunately, due to time constraints, we couldn't get to them all. But thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to our speakers, and I bid you farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Sorry, I'm asked to mention, which I nearly forgot, that there is, the webinar is free, but UKLFI is a charity, and donations therefore will be very welcome. And those can be made by clicking on the donate button at www.uklficharity.com. Then finally, that UKLFI will welcome feedback as far as, if I may be so bold, only positive feedback, please, for our excellent speakers and for yours truly. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and farewell.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rodolfo.